Thank you for attending this breakout session. This session is filled with powerful information to help improve your health and empower you. Radio Free 102.3 KJLH. We are you.
COVID-19, protests, riots, looting, police brutality. Say her name. Say his name. What's his name? What's her name? What are their names? CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. Cases rising, quarantine, stay home, pandemic, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, blue lives matter. My mental health matters. How do I control, stabilize, and maneuver through this junction and find out how to function in the year 2020? Hello, I'm Tammy Mack, host of the Tammy Mack Show from 3 to 7 p.m. on Radio Free 102.3 KJLH, and welcome to the KJLH Virtual Women's Health Expo Mental Health Breakout Session. KJLH has gathered some of the brightest and most prominent health professionals in the country to help us gather our thoughts, woosah, collect our peace of mind, and find the bright light in this dark day of shocking, unexplainable, unimaginable, historical epic year of terror, 2020. So Latina Jackson has worked in the mental health field for over 25 years. And in her current assignment as Deputy Director for Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, Ms. Jackson oversees the delivery of mental health services to some of the most vulnerable and impaired individuals living with mental health or mental illness, people experiencing homelessness, veterans, and individuals with mental illness who are justice involved. We'll talk about that. Her career path includes special education teacher for children with severe emotional disturbance, community integration leader for adults with development disorders, deputy director of the Youth Services Department of the Los Angeles LGBT Center, and serving as adjunct faculty at California State University Northridge Master in Social Work program. Karis Myrick has held some of the highest level positions in the world of mental health peer support. She was executive director of a large nonprofit, president of the board of directors of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and director of the Department of Consumer Affairs at federal agency. Today, as chief of peer and allied mental health professions for the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, she oversees the training and supervision of some 600 community health workers, mental health advocates, peer supporters, and medical caseworkers. Dr. Curly Bonds is Mental Health Chief Deputy Director, Clinical Operations, Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, and a psychiatrist with extensive experience in a variety of clinical, academic, and research settings. Most recently, he is the chair of psychiatry and behavioral medicine at Charles R. Drew University School of Medicine in Los Angeles, and was the medical director for D.D. Hirsch Mental Health Services. Dr. Bonds is a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and a fellow of the Academy of Consultation Liaison Psychiatry. And Yvette Willock. Yvette has over 25 years of diverse clinical social work practice. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Loyola Marymount University and holds 2 graduate degrees. Somehow, I knew my tongue would tie up on that one. A Master of Social Work from the University of Southern California, and a Master of Arts in Human and Organizational Systems from Fielding Graduate University. Ms. Willock is currently Chief of Social Services for the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. Please welcome each and every one of our health professionals. Hi. Everybody all good today?
Yeah.
I wanted to start here because there was something that I saw in a bio here, and let me go back to it, that struck interest. It was the mental health of those in justice. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did say that right. Those that are justice involved.
So, I found that to stick out because right now, so many people are involved in justice, Latina.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that mean what I think it means? Does that mean that people who are so involved in social issues and social changes that they themselves develop mental illnesses that have to be dealt with?
No, actually, that's not what it means. But I think you're spot on in that regard. That people are entangled in that way. What I was referring to in that is individuals that are experiencing mental illness that find themselves entangled in the criminal justice system.
Ah,
As a direct consequence of symptoms of those mental illnesses.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Completely
Yeah.
understood. But
Yeah.
yeah. But I would think that today, with the climate that we're in, everyone's mental health is being questioned and called to the carpet and put on the forefront. I mean, as I stated in the beginning, we've got a lot to think about. We've got COVID, we've got protests, we've got Black men being killed at an alarming rate now, even after protests for justice. How can one stay sane in the current environment? And am I even politically incorrect to call it insanity when we're referring to mental illness? I think I'll go to you on that, Dr. Bonds.
Well, we don't use insanity anymore when we describe mental illnesses. We prefer things like brain disease or behavioral disorder. But I think, especially in communities of color, the term mental illness can be off-putting. So I like to think of these as difficulties with functioning, difficulties with being in the world. There is a lot of what we lay people call insanity out there, though. And I think one of the best ways to stay sane and safe is to just focus on what your priorities are. Focus on the people that are dear to you, focus on getting your job done if you're lucky enough to have one, and doing the things to follow the guidance that we get from the Department of Public Health about being safe in the midst of this pandemic. It feels like the messages are constantly changing. First, it was about social distancing, then it became physical distancing. We rebranded it because you have to remain close to people despite keeping a safe distance from them. I would also say that we have to do things to take care of ourselves: exercise, eating right, avoiding bad habits. And if you have time, take some time out to meditate, which I can talk about more later if you'd like me to.
Well, you said a mouthful, and it's easier said than done when you're talking about staying at home and quarantining and eating healthy. I find myself eating more junk food than I've ever consumed. I eat stuff now that I was eating when I was like 12 years old. I'm like, oh, those Mountlaters look good. Oh, I think I'll grab some of those stuff, Oreos with Cheeto tasted flavorings on the outside. Like, I don't know what is it about this quarantine that leads us to experimenting with the worst kinds of food versus eating the healthier kind of foods? And how can we get away from that, if you will? Karis.
Mute.
Oh, yes, go ahead, Dr. Bonds.
Okay, so I think these are really great questions. And, I'm sitting here kind of thinking, oh my gosh, she's speaking my life. Why is she speaking my life at the moment? But one of the things I am doing as you're speaking my life is I am pedaling under my desk on a little pedal machine. Oh. So that, it's one way to think about like different ways in which we can, maintain even in the midst of some habits that we wouldn't want to have. So, I'm a person with lived experience of a mental health condition. So in my work day to day, in my personal life, I always have to pay attention to all of the things that you've been talking about. And especially as a woman of color, like how are all of these things, intersecting and impacting me? And what are some of the things that I do to maintain? So yeah, every once in a while I'll have that Cheeto dipped in chocolate. I will not because that's gross, but I will have a Cheeto. And then after I'm done with
Don't knock it before you try it.
No, it's on my list. It is on my list. But, that if I have that Cheeto or that thing that makes me feel good in the moment, then I also balance it with other things that I know will also help me feel good, which is exercise or walking or getting on the phone and talking with a friend, supporting somebody else, because then I get to be the helper versus somebody maybe who always needs help. So those are some of the things that I think about.
Right. And there's so many questions right now in reference to mental health and mental illness. I want to kind of take them in compartments, if you will, just so we can kind of stay on track here. I want to tackle racism and mental health first, because that's what we're dealing with in our current circumstances, is the fight for equality, the fight for justice, but that has to have an effect on our mental health. And I want to speak directly to the George Floyd event in this situation. There was a young woman who recorded George Floyd being choked to death by the police officer's knee on his neck for those 8 minutes and 46 seconds. She recorded it much longer than it happened, but she literally watched a man die in real time. And I think after the event happened, there's video of her saying, "Oh my God, I'm traumatized for the rest of my life." So as it's happening, I'm sure you're thinking world star, and you're like, "Oh, I'm gonna post this." But when you realize, oh my God, I just watched a man die at the hands of the police in real life. This is going to affect me for the rest of my life. And she was there and saw it happen. The world saw it happen via video. It has to have a mental effect on us. How can any one of you speak to that? Yvette, let's go to you.
Certainly. Thank you, Tammy. And that's almost a textbook definition of trauma, and one of the diagnoses in the DSM that we use when we're meeting with individuals is about observing someone whose life potentially was at risk of ending, or it actually ended. And this young woman, she actually videotaped somebody's life being snuffed out from them. And so it is 100% understandable that she would have an experience of trauma, being present, observing it. And then the rest of us who observed it through video, that we are also seeing that event taking place where somebody's life is being snuffed out. And then us beginning to think part of the trauma experiences, that could be me too. I could see how I could be at the hands of that officer, or, you know, as an African-American woman, yeah, that could be me, but definitely my African-American brother or an African-American father, cousin, who are male, that could easily be them. And the trauma experience that we go through as a result of witnessing that. So that definitely is something that we understand that will have an impact on individuals, our communities, in Los Angeles, across the nation, and across the world. And many emotions. I know you have a lot of questions, so I won't go too far, but so many other emotions that surfaced around that: anxiety, anger, irritability, depression, sadness. These are all understandable responses, emotional responses, that we just have to recognize it's okay, in the sense that it's nothing to be fearful that we're experiencing those emotions. The question is now, how do we respond to those emotions so we do not become paralyzed? And I'm quite sure that we'll have an opportunity to speak further about that.
Yes, Latina, actually, I would like to know, how do we respond to that? How do we deal with that, the trauma of watching a man die on national television?
Right. Well, you know, part of it is about that, you know, and it's an interesting time because, as Dr. Bond spoke to, we're in the midst of this this requirement to distance from one another, when what we need more now than ever in the face of trauma is about connection.
Is a hug.
Right?
Yeah.
And just it's about connection. So I think, you know, it is about finding ways to connect, and it's about finding ways to discuss that experience and to share that experience with others and talk about the ways that it has impacted us. And I think unique to African Americans in this country is that video was just it was traumatic, but it was a point in time that so many of us can relate to on a fundamental level, and it's generational trauma. You know, that's absolutely right. It is about the trauma in that moment, the trauma of watching that video and that tragic loss of life. But it also has sparked an intergenerational trauma that African Americans in this country have experienced time and time again, whether, you know, it's lynching or police interactions that go awry in horrible ways. But I think that has been a huge part of the spark, is that we've been distanced from one another for long periods of time. We haven't had, you know, the connection and the brotherhood and sisterhood that we require as human beings. You know, there's a soul connection. And then on top of that, we have this traumatic experience that now we have to find a way to contain. And in addition to that, we have all of the trauma from our historical reality of being African Americans in this country, and all that has brought with historically.
Yeah. Can you talk, Dr. Bonds, about the historical damages and trauma that African Americans have had to deal with throughout, from slavery to the civil rights movement to Jim Crow laws to today?
Unfortunately, I can. And I would say that there is a term that's been coined called the post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And it is an element of post-traumatic stress syndrome that's very specific to those of African descent, because unlike any other immigrant group to this country, our ancestors were brought here involuntarily. I mean, I'm not talking about as children or as minors, but as grown adults brought here against their will and then enslaved and captured. And I think there's a legacy that's borne out through the laws that were designed to keep Africans under control that exist now. We know that the police as it currently exists started out as slave patrols. And I think that legacy for many years was something where through structural racism, things like redlining, inequitable distribution of wealth, to keep people in their place and to make sure that those who were in power contained that power. We see that now being borne out in some of the protests where they're anti-protests, where people feel like, well, we don't want to talk about Black lives because of all lives. Well, it negates the fact that African Americans and Black Americans have specific, unique types of structural racism in this country that have persisted for decades, for centuries, honestly. And I think that when I was hearing about some of the changes that happened as a result of viewing these events, there's good medical literature that suggests that African Americans in particular, after police killing, if you look at a community where that happens, and then you survey Black Americans about their health status, there are more sick days that are missed from work. People just have vague complaints and they can't really quite place it, but it's often linked back to that event happening. There's a blip. There was another study that was looking at cortisol levels in college students, and it was done at a time at Duke University, where there was an incident involving the lacrosse team and an alleged misconduct of some of those players. And they looked at the students before and after that event, and they saw spikes in cortisol, which is a stress hormone that the body makes that can be helpful in times of stress, but if it's chronically elevated, it debilitates us. I think we bear this out in chronic rates of high blood pressure and also high rates of diabetes. There are a lot of heart disease in the Black community that's more so than in other communities, which has then placed us at higher risk when it comes to COVID. The things like obesity and hypertension, all of those things make your outcomes less positive if you're a person who's suffering from those things. So if you combine that with the pandemic, the racism and the stress that people are experiencing just elevates itself to a level to where we're seeing that Black Americans are dying twice more than other Americans at the result of the pandemic.
I think I'm due a couple of sick days, I hear up in there somewhere, right? I mean, it has really been difficult for me personally, because I have to follow these stories nonstop. And as soon as there's one story and you've talked about it, here comes another one, and you now have to talk about it. And you also have to allow listeners and people to vent and to talk about how they feel about it, because you want to be a platform to allow people to get it off their chest so that it won't manifest in the streets. And I think Radio Free KJLH has done an extremely good job with allowing the platform for the community to talk about it and vent, so that it doesn't become something that manifests into big, huge riots and civil unrest, so to speak. I'd like to talk to you, Karis, in terms of what Dr. Bonds is saying. What do we do? Okay, so we realize that we're a bit traumatized by what's going on, but aside from, we can't hug too many people, right? We're in the midst of a pandemic. So aside from that, what are some things that we can do to assure that at least we're keeping some sort of stability with our mental health?
Yeah, I think these are great questions. I mean, it is, just really curious times with this convergence of so many things. And, I think what our workforces have been doing is very much what humans do during times of distress and trauma, which is to try to find some support from others. So what peer supporters do, as an example of people with lived experience of mental health conditions or family members or parents, is to support each other during this time finding that space to have these conversations in ways that are productive and helpful, so that, you know, you're not kind of internalizing it and it's not eating you alive. You have a safe space to talk about these things with each other, and also with people who've sort of been there, done that, and have an understanding of it and are able to empathize and do active listening. I think the other thing that we also encourage each other to do is to be mindful of how much trolling on social media are you doing. You know, maybe it's time to take a tech break and kind of put the phone down or turn the social media off, or to utilize that phone and technology for something positive. That certainly you can use your Insta and your, YouTube or your Twitch or whatever to put out positive messages, so that, we can fill the airways with something that's equally positive and not soak in always the negative or the hurtful things that we have to live with. Lastly, I think, just being able to tell our personal stories so that we're reducing this is one way to reduce stigma and to ensure that people who do need a little extra help feel more comfortable to reach out and get it, because we do have that kind of stigma around, oh, I don't want to have a mental illness and go see, I want to do that. But sometimes we need it and it's okay.
Yeah, I think you talk about how you need to find something that's a little more positive to cling to in times like this. And I think my go-to is, my guilty pleasure is the Golden Girls. I watch the Golden Girls. And so I'm thinking there's absolutely nothing that can be negative about the Golden Girls, right? And lo and behold, they have to replace an episode of the Golden Girls where they're in blackface. Like, no, wow, my Golden Girls too. How did Blanche and them get wrapped up in social issues? But I knew exactly the episode they were talking about, because I know every episode. And I'm like, look, wow. I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I think I could let that one slide. Like, we do have a sense of humor, and we can tell the difference between intent and intentionally. When you're doing something to hurt us. But I think Black people overall have probably our sense of humor is at a high rate because of so much that we
has to be, yeah.
And we've had to laugh about it. Yeah, please. Yeah. Talk about that, Latina.
Yeah, I mean, I think, humor is like one of those things that carries us, through in the midst of this. It's important to laugh, kind of, what Dr. Bonds was talking about, your cortisol levels, that stress hormone. The same with laughter and exercise, you release endorphins, which, counter that. It lifts your spirits and, buoys you up a bit to get through the hard times. And to, when you're inundated with all of these images of protest and the things that have happened after the protest, it's important to laugh. It's critical. To sing, to dance, to do whatever it is to get that energy out of you, and to replenish your soul in that way. All of those activities can lead and enhance your mental health and your mental well-being.
Yeah, I like that, to replenish your soul.
Yes.
Yeah, to replenish your soul. I like that, because Black folk, we full of soul.
Yes, we are.
We got that son. We got soul. Yeah. I'd like to move to COVID-19 and mental health now, if you will. COVID-19 has affected mental health for our community. I was unaware of this, and I don't really understand why, but I guess if I looked deep into my own personal life, I would understand why, because I'm married, I have a husband, and COVID had him so fearful that he was like, hey, can you turn your back when you talk to me? Because I don't want your droplets coming out. And I was thinking, you got a mental problem. So how does that affect your mentality, this COVID-19, Yvette?
One of the things that I think about a lot with that is the level of uncertainty and unknown about COVID-19, as we are learning more as time goes on. But when this crisis first hit our shores and we became more aware of it, we didn't know much about it. We just knew that it almost seemed as though it was a death sentence for certain groups of individuals. And that even our young people were having some significant responses and that we weren't expecting. So this level of uncertainty and just the unknown about it there is a natural response as human beings to be a little fearful, to have some anxiety about uncertainty and the unknown, especially when it is that we realize there could be a negative outcome, like significant illness, episodes of illness, and yes, even death. So that's a big part of it. And then connected with anxiety, anxiety can manifest itself in very different ways that we might not think about. So we might have difficulty sleeping as the result of just having a lot of anxiety and worrying. And we might not connect that. We just realize I haven't been sleeping a lot. And then the toll that takes, I feel, fatigued and tired the next day. And Dr. Bonds talked a little bit about, seeing that there are impacts on, I'm not going to work as I usually would. And it's interesting you talk about your husband. I was listening to a news show yesterday, and the mayor of Atlanta, she tested positive for COVID-19. I think yesterday is when she got the test results back. And she said she was preparing. She went into mommy mode to prepare food for her family. And she said one of her children said, "Don't touch my food." And as much as that seemed, they joked and laughed about it, I thought about that for her as a mother. And being a mother, one of the functions is nurturing.
Yes.
One of the ways we nurture is we feed. I can speak that for my grandmothers, my mothers. They take such pride in what am I going to prepare for the children? Even though I'm an adult, it's still the children.
Yeah.
And it's as though her child said, no, you can't do that. And this unknown, uncertainty about, I don't know what's going to happen if I get the virus from mommy. What must that do to her? She understands it intellectually, but at a core, what is that? I can't be a mother.
Yes. That is so right, Eva. Yes.
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 And then the work that she needs to do to not hold that, so that she then becomes depressed. She becomes sad about not being able to mother the way that she mothers. And there's nothing wrong with mothering that way. And so it's so important for us to recognize that we're going to have a variety of responses, and for us to just be aware that it's okay. Let me understand where this response is coming from, but not to move to a space where, I shouldn't feel that way, because that's not us honoring ourselves and what our experience is. And it's so important to honor what we're experiencing during this time. And has been said by so many on the panel, the need to connect with others, because there's going to be another mother who's going to have a like experience. And for her to know I'm not alone, there's something about community, of knowing I'm not alone in a certain experience, and then we grow from there.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the differences between, or the disparity, I should say, between Black people dying of COVID-19 and other ethnicities, not at such an alarming rate. And I'll go to you on this one, Harris, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so and I might ask Dr. Bonds to help me out with this as well. But when we look at the disparities of people of the population, African Americans compared to their size in LA, it was at one point nearly twice the proportion of people who are passing away from COVID who are African American compared to their size. Now that's because of the disparities that already exist for African Americans in general around access to healthcare, high rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, as Dr. Bonds was discussing earlier. And those are some of the conditions that make people more vulnerable to COVID and the effects of COVID. Secondarily, we're folks who are the essential workers. So if you look at who are the essential workers, and I'm including doctors, providers, grocery folks, people who are keeping everything open while everything is closed, they look like us. And so that kind of also can put us at higher risk. So I think those are, this time period has really shown a super bright light on the disparities that have historically existed for African Americans related to poverty, access to healthcare, or access to good healthcare, being folks who are out there kind of doing the hard work. We've always done that, right? And then getting the supports that we need in order to be and stay safe. I think lastly, the way that we grieve. So when we're, losing some of our loved ones, our friends, our family, we can't grieve the way that we do kind of in that cultural way anymore. So, and I know that kind of hit my family. My father was very upset. He couldn't go to a funeral of one of his cousins. I couldn't go. I'm here. They're in Florida. And he was real, and he's vulnerable. He has a heart condition, et cetera. So he was really concerned about not being able to go, and kind of tipped him, and it was like helping him and others through how do we get through this time with all of these disparities and effects in ways that can get us as close to being who we are culturally as well as being safe.
Yeah, because culturally, funerals are kind of our thing, if you will. I don't mean that. I mean, I'm Black, so, I think I can speak to it. It's where we show up and show out in a whole different way. And to not be able to say goodbye to our loved ones really touches the heart of Black folk. Dr. Bond, speak to the disparity in Black people dying versus other ethnicities dying when it comes to COVID-19 and how that affects us mentally.
Well, this has been a very fascinating pandemic from an epidemiologic standpoint. I would say that, Karis, you got all the numbers right. It's really been about 2 to 1 for Black Americans, but other groups also are disproportionately affected, including Asian Americans, Hawaiian Americans, Pacific Islanders, even here within LA County. Early on, I think what we saw was that communities that were more affluent, which tend not to be communities of color, have greater access to testing, which meant that those communities were able to stand up things like prevention, get the word out. I know that the first results looked as if there were pockets of COVID in communities that you wouldn't necessarily think, like Brentwood.
Right.
There was also one that was sort of in the Melrose area, right? And meanwhile, when you looked at the numbers for places in the so-called traditional hood, it was almost as if COVID didn't exist. So I think that gave a false sense of security, because that was all based on the fact that, there wasn't testing set up in, say, Compton or Watts or Willowbrook. Fortunately now, though, as more testing sites have been set up, one of them is at the Charles Drew University campus that's in South LA, where they tested, 1,000 people within a short period of time. So I think as we get more testing out and the word gets out, people are finally getting the message.
That's so interesting. I hate to cut you off, Dr. Bonds, but I just had a thought click in my head. It's so interesting because when the coronavirus was first announced to the world, there was this urban legend that Black folk don't get it.
Right.
Yes.
And
Right.
now to hear you say that the reason why it seemed as if we didn't get it was because we weren't being tested, because we didn't have access to tests like those affluent neighborhoods. That is so mind blown.
Yeah.
I mean, it leads to the direct, how we're in need when it comes to everything in terms of healthcare in America today. I mean, I often laughed at it too. I was like, oh yeah, Black people don't get it. I was a part of that team. That was a part of the Black people don't get it team, and then it started hitting home and Black people I knew start getting it. And I was like, wait, what happened? Now all of a sudden, Black people are not only getting coronavirus, they're dying from it. They're on ventilators in the hospital. What happened? And I was like, here go this conspiracy again. There's a conspiracy against Black people. How does a disease that initially affected affluent white people become our problem now? And I'm just speaking from a keep it real kind of perspective, because that's really where Black people's head was like, wait a minute, how did it start happening to us? We good.
Right.
And so for you to say that makes absolute sense. Of course we didn't have it. We weren't allowed, we did not have access to testing.
Right. And so that was the early stage. And I would say now that testing has been equalized, what we're still seeing, though, is that death rates for Black Americans are about 13.2 per 100,000 compared to white Americans, where it's about 5.7. So still, it's like double, almost triple that. And I think other ethnic groups like Latinos, it's really high for them too, about 10 per 100,000, which is how we measure the number of deaths as a percentage. But it's because Black folk often, when they do get the mild symptoms, they don't necessarily rush out to the doctor. Part of it because they may be uninsured or underinsured. And so they don't realize that they can go and get tested quickly. And then once you get tested, you have to have treatment if you turn out to be positive, or be able to take care of yourself, being able to get all the healthy foods and the access to care that you need. And poverty seems to co-sort with deaths when it comes to COVID. And we know that poverty is unequally distributed throughout our community because of some of the issues that we talked about earlier. earlier of structural injustice in terms of access to hospitals, emergency rooms, and early on testing. Having a primary care doctor who knows you, who you can call up to say, look, I've got these symptoms, what should I do? Not everybody has the access to call the helpline for their healthcare provider. Some people have to go to the county. And I think a lot of people were avoiding healthcare settings early on because they were afraid they might get it. So they tended to ignore some things thinking, oh no, this isn't COVID. But if it turned out that it was, the quicker that you get to care, the more likely that we can avoid having to put down an air tube and mechanically ventilate you. So getting the symptoms, getting treatment early, and not waiting until the last minute is really, really important.
Well, it's interesting you talk about getting treatment early, because it's my understanding, and I'm glad you all are here to correct my misunderstanding if that's what it is, but it's my understanding if you are diagnosed or test positive for COVID, they send you home. And so when you talk about treatment, it's there is no treatment, there is no cure. And so the only thing you can technically do is go home.
Well, it depends on the situation. What we talk about for things that there is no cure, that is absolutely correct. There are a few medications that are having trials. We know that there are some that have been famously dismantled as being helpful for COVID, like hydrochloroquine. But we do think that if you do have symptoms, there's a certain point where their symptoms are more severe. If you have shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, high fever, then you shouldn't be staying home with that. You should be talking to your primary care provider to determine at what point do I present to hospital. Once that person gets to the hospital, the goal is to keep them off a ventilator for as long as possible. And that's what we call supportive care. We're going to give them all the fluids they need so they stay well hydrated, make sure they get nutrition, make sure that they're getting their temperature monitored, they're getting whatever types of what we call fever reducers or antipyretics. Those things need to be administered. And I think if we can do all of that early on in a very aggressive way, we can avoid some people ending up in the ICU. There were a fair number of folks early on who didn't get tested, didn't know they had symptoms. They got symptoms pretty quickly, didn't do anything about it. And within a few days' time, they would expire because they didn't go and get help. So it's important, if you're having symptoms beyond a certain point, don't think that this is a death sentence, I'm automatically going to die, because there are a lot of things that we can do short of putting someone on mechanical ventilation that can help.
And the positive thing in all this is more people do live than die when they test positive for coronavirus.
Absolutely, right. And of course, there are those people who are totally asymptomatic. I think recently Autumn Burke, a Assemblywoman, had COVID test that was positive, as well as her child, and they were totally symptom-free. But then that's when you need to understand that you have to protect others from you, because you may be just fine, but you can pass it on to someone else, and that can be a deadly transmission.
So I have a personal question, and I don't know, either of you can answer this question. My husband and I went to get tested at the same time. He got his test results back. He's negative. I have not gotten my test results back. And I'm concerned because if we're in the same house and we're doing things, can one person be positive and the other person be negative? And should I stop connecting with him now?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say. I wouldn't go so far as to say stop connecting with him. You might want to connect from a safe distance until you get the results back. But just to tell you a little bit about what I know, and again, I'm not an infectious disease specialist. Right. This is when I wish we had Dr. Muntu Davis in the house who can tell us, the public health officer. It's actually, sometimes the test results don't always come back. They run them in batches. It could be that your test had something that was indeterminate, so they need to run additional tests on it. So it could take longer. It doesn't mean that you're positive, but I think sometimes they have to do secondary tests on any type of screen. This happens, like, for example, with HIV, there's a secondary confirmatory test. The other thing is it could just be that the sample somehow got separated at the lab, and instead of being put on the Monday batch, you were put in the Tuesday batch. So those results may come back. But I would definitely call them to follow up to say, hey, look, we went tested on the same day. He has his, I don't have mine. What's up with that? Because it's unlikely that it should be more than, say, a 24-hour delay. And in that case, then you may want to be more careful. But again,
I'm just trying to figure out if I can still kiss or not. I'm just trying to figure out, can I slip my tongue in his mouth?
You're going to get me into trouble. I'm not going to touch that one.
Dr. Bond's like, hey, I don't have nothing to do with that. I would like to talk about the protest. I want to go back to the protest because they talked about how the protest could potentially exacerbate the numbers of cases with COVID-19. And I think that that in itself has something to do with your mental state in terms of, should I go protesting? I should not go protesting, but I want to fight for rights. But then there's this pandemic going on. Now, it turns out that there are reports and surveys that say that the increase that we're currently getting with COVID are not from the protest, because if they were, they would be seen, the increases would be seen in many more states at larger rates. And so they don't necessarily connect the COVID cases increases to the protests. So how can we talk about that, Karis?
Wow, just put me on that big spot. But yeah, you know, it's so powerful because we're in the midst of wanting to take action, but during a time, we have to be careful. So the question is, well, do I go out protesting and I go in a hazmat suit? Do I go out protesting and be mindful of social distancing, wearing a mask, you know, possibly having gloves on? If I did it personally, I would probably have gloves on as well. That's just me. So, you know, whether or not we see increases that are due to people participating in the protest, I really can't answer that. That's not my area of expertise, other than recognizing for people's mental health, sometimes, yes, there is this, I feel as if I need to take action. Inaction is what is making me feel depressed, anxious, sick. Somebody's taking over, I don't have control. So where can I get that control?
Yes.
So the answer becomes, okay, if I have to take action, how can I do it in ways that can help me keep as safe as I possibly can? Do I want to write a blog and put a blog out? Do I want to have a Zoom meeting with some friends and come up with some kind of project that we could share in another space? Do I want to be on a podcast? You know, do I want to be on a radio show? You know, I went out, I live in the Hollywood area, so I went out to see the Black Lives Matters painted on the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when nobody else was there. So did I get to kind of take part? Yes, I did. Did I do it in a way that I felt most safe? Yes, I did. And then I shared the pictures and my thoughts with others. So I got that kind of need fulfilled of taking part, and as if I have a role, but I also did it mindful of. So I think there's kind of a both and to it, so that our mental health isn't sacrificed because we're wanting to take action, something that is very important and personal to us as Black people.
Yeah, and this whole COVID-19 thing can definitely stress you out and make you mental for having to stay at home. I mean, you can go mental, like you can really, for me, if you're a person who goes out all the time and you're used to socially connecting with people, and I'm a performer, you know, so I'm oftentimes on stage doing theater, or I'm hosting a show where there are real people, not virtually like we're doing now. I mean, speaking to this very KJLH Women's Health Expo, normally we would be in the Long Beach Convention Center with thousands of people talking about these issues and allowing them to have questions back and interacting and participating in this journey. And so it has to affect your mentality to not be able to do that. Yvette?
You know, as Tammy, as you were bringing it up, what I immediately went to is that we're experiencing loss of how we used to move and have our being. And it's okay. I think it's okay to acknowledge that and embrace that and say, you know, I've lost the way that I used to do things, and it's a loss, and to grieve the loss, and then say, but I'm still here. I'm still here.
Right.
What can I do with the realities in which I now have to move and have my being? And as you know, Karis was pointing out, you know, and in the previous question around the folks who went out to participate in the protests, when you look at resilience communities, individuals being resilient in the presence of trauma that we're experiencing. Some of the literature talks about one of the ways to gain resilience, that bounce back, to overcome, is to engage in things where you feel like you're contributing or you're regaining a sense of control in a situation where you feel there is no control. And that's one of the things I think that led some people to participate in the protests, is that I'm going to be able to contribute to this cause by me walking with people. And I'm going to do it my best in a safe manner. I'm going to have my masks on, my shields on. I saw some of that happening as well. And it's a way that people were seeking to not allow the loss, not allow the trauma to take control, but to recognize there are some things that I can do to be able to still honor who I am, and but I'm doing it in a different way. And that the importance of, we said this so many times and we cannot underscore it, the importance of how do I connect? We're human beings. There's something in us that draws towards connection. And what are the new ways I'm going to have to connect? I'm not one who, this is my platform. I didn't do the video conferencing. I was not on Zoom before, did not do Skype, didn't do any of it. Right. I would talk to you on the phone, just the old school way. But
did you at least FaceTime? Did you at least FaceTime?
Say that again?
Did you at least FaceTime?
I did not. I didn't do any of it. You could call me a dinosaur, Tammy, call me dinosaur. But in this time when I couldn't just hang out on the couch with my best friend after church and just shoot the breeze, talk about stuff, that was our normal Sunday. And I couldn't do that anymore. But I knew the value of connecting. So I said, girl, I'm calling you, we're gonna video conference, and I'm doing something new. And so this is now a natural thing. I didn't feel anything about being part of this platform today, this panel, doing it on Zoom, because I've been doing so much video conferencing. I've grown as a human being as a result of the pandemic. Yeah. And one of the things that I've shared with people is I have to find purpose in the pandemic.
Oh, what is purpose in the pandemic? Yes. Hashtag that. Purpose in
hashtag it.
Yes. Yes.
And it's almost sometimes I have to fight for it, but I choose to do so because I cannot allow this time to be one where I look back and say those were the lost months. They cannot be lost because I'm still alive. We're all still alive. And as we're alive, there's purpose yet for our lives. And where do I find it? And how do I move in it?
We're definitely a part of a new normal now.
Yes.
A lot of things are changing, and that could definitely affect our mentality and the way that we think and the way that we feel, more importantly, the way that we feel. And I know that depression has grown during this pandemic, during these protests. And I want to talk about how depression has set in for some people who've never been depressed before, and people who have suffered from depression, and how do they deal with it now on an even higher level if there is an anarchy to depression. Latina, let's talk about that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and it's contributory, the fact that we are disconnected from one another and we don't have the same routines that we used to have before. And so much of, when someone is really, profoundly depressed is about, that inability to move and to, kind of get out in the world. And now you're stuck in your house all day, every day, looking at the same people, same furniture, etc. So, I think part of it is about creating new rituals in our lives. I've talked to many friends and family in my own family that we now have, our Sunday chat that we all get together and we connect in that way. It is about, creating, if you're working from home, and sometimes, like it sounds like we're similar, you connect with people on a regular basis, like you're a social person, that it might be, creating routines in your life, like, if you're working from home, it might be necessary to get up and, take a shower, not keep on your pajamas all day and working from home, but to get into the routine of taking a shower, coming into a room and, participating in whatever your Zoom meeting or your conference in a way that's kind of ritualized and routine, so you can get back to some sense of normalcy. And also, again, like, sharing with family members and loved ones, finding a way to connect with them on a regular basis, to talk about what you're experiencing and what you're feeling around this COVID crazy, and around the protests and all that has come with it and everything that's been triggered as a consequence.
Yeah.
I
find that me working from home, my home is no longer my sanctuary.
Right. Mm-hmm. Everything bleeds, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't have this separation. There's no work-life balance anymore unless you intentionally create that. Your life can become work.
Yeah, I usually come home and I flop on my couch like,
Right.
Now I come home, I flop on my couch and I'm like, oh, dang, I got the lights, I got the microphones, I got the cameras. This is no longer my sanctuary. This is my job.
Got to create that space. Put those microphones in a room where that's where you're going to work, and create that distance for yourself and that sacred space that we all need.
I want to talk about, how do you know when your mental illness and your mental health becomes so problematic that you need medication? Dr. Bond.
How did I know you were going to point to my box for that one? So,
Paris first, but okay.
Of course, first of all, I want to say that medication should never be a first stop. I mean, I would say that, I'm sure Karis would support me, talk to a peer, talk to someone who you can relate to, who maybe has been there, so they can maybe give you some insight. And then if I were to talk to Latina or Yvette, they would probably say, you can talk to a therapist, because psychotherapy does change the brain in the same way that medications can. It may take a little bit longer, it may not be as fast, but there are changes in the brain that we can measure biochemically from
So are you
therapy.
saying, I just want to make this clear, are you saying that psychotherapy can be as effective as medication?
Absolutely.
Really?
And in fact, in minor to moderate types of depression, that is the preferred starting point. And definitely in children, where we avoid medications at first because we don't know that their brains are going to respond the same. I mean, there are certain medications that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration for kids, but the vast majority are not. So we tend to start out with at least 8 sessions or so of cognitive behavioral therapy to see if we can make an improvement. And then, and only then, I think in the ideal situation, do refer to a psychiatrist. But we do know that in our sort of fast food society, people want a quick fix. Nobody wants to wait 8 weeks, but honestly, medications don't work overnight. The type of medications that we use to treat depression are going to target specific symptoms. So let me back up a minute. I get ahead of myself and talk about, when does a person need medication? So let's say that you've tried prayer, you've tried meditation, you've tried talking to peers, you've tried walking your dog. All those things don't help, and you find yourself with functional limitations. It has to be impairing your ability to function. If you're not able to get up out of bed every day, if you're not eating because you don't have an appetite and you're losing weight. Or the flip side of that, a lot of us tend to overeat because we're seeking out those comfort foods. We talked earlier about serotonin, or that's one of the brain chemicals that we know is in our brain and in our gut. So if you have changes in your habits to where you have no energy, you're tired all the time, and you just can't get through the day, and then there are those very, very serious red flags, like having suicidal thoughts that I don't want to go on. And these probably are more common in our sisters when they get depression. Men, when they get depressed, they tend to act out. They use drugs, they'll be violent, they'll do all kinds of things to externalize the behavior. Whereas for women who are more prone to have depression for a number of reasons, it's more internalized, feeling guilty, feeling like you should have done differently or should have done more. If you find yourself immersed in those symptoms, that's when it's time to talk to your doctor, who might say, here's a medication. There's a whole host of medications that are very safe, that are effective, but they do take some time to work. Generally, an antidepressant is not like a happy pill. You don't just take it and feel good the next day. By the same token, once you feel better, you should stay on it for a while until you're instructed by your healthcare provider to stop it. But they take anywhere from 1 week up to 6 weeks to work. And medications, honestly, are very effective for treating some of those target symptoms that I mentioned, changes in appetite, sleep, energy. Those are the things that are more likely to improve before your mood improves. That might take a little bit longer. But honestly, it's about the severity of the functional impairment when we think about going to medications more as a first line.
Now I want to go back to the protests, because they sparked something. The protests sparked the need for defunding the police, or shall I say, the outcry to defund the police. And in Los Angeles County, the suggestion, I'm not sure if it's been approved or not yet, but the suggestion and the idea here is to not utilize the police when it comes to people who have mental illness. How do you feel about that? Should the police still be involved in these types of phone calls or dispatches, or is this a good way to move with the police not being involved in mental health dispatches? Karis?
So my first interaction with the mental health system was the police coming to my door and taking me to the police station, and telling me that they were taking me because I was sick, but they took me in the back of a police car in handcuffs. I had to show up at a police station with another African-American gentleman sitting next to me who was there for some gun something, and there was a gun in a gun case. And it was very discombobulating for me, in the sense of, you're telling me I'm sick, but I'm in handcuffs. You're telling me I'm sick and I need help, but I'm not at a hospital. And you're telling me I'm sick and I'm a Black person that you have just come to as a policeman, and I don't know about my own safety right now, when the idea is you're supposed to be helping me to get help. So it was really, really one of those things, at least for me and for many people, when they talk about this experience, that makes it harder for people to engage in mental health care because they feel that's mental health care. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a couple of things when I think about the role of police as first responders. You know, if somebody has a baby and you call 911, sometimes the police may be the first people to show up and help deliver that baby, and then the ambulance comes along and whatever. In general, though, I think when police are called to intercede or to help out in a mental health emergency, it's because the person is at crisis and nobody quite knows what to do. And I think if we really trained folks who are non-police, who are not like law enforcement, to support folks when they're at that most vulnerable in crisis, to be with that person during that crisis, to help them get to, if it's to the hospital, if it's to the ER, if it's to somebody else's house where somebody knows, how to help them and they trust that person. That I think that's a first step to building up a system in which there are other responses other than law enforcement as a response. So I think law enforcement has unfortunately become our default response, because there has never really been a fully funded and full out funded community-based supports for people.
That's because the police are getting full out funded.
Yeah, well, okay. So what I'm going to say is,
the criminal justice system as a whole.
I mean, to me, it's like, what if somebody else had come to my door? What if somebody else, and eventually, our police department did get what's called crisis intervention team funding, where somebody who is a law enforcement officer who's trained in how to work with mental health conditions, especially in crisis. They're not wearing a uniform, they're plain clothes. The car is plain car. So my neighbors don't know this. When they came the first time, my neighbor's like, "Oh, Dad, what's she do? She been dropped, right?" And I'm like, so embarrassing.
Right, exactly.
The second time, or not the second time, it was many times later, it was, this plainclothes person and I believe it was like a social worker who had also been trained. And, they lightly rapped at the door. They asked, how could they be helpful for me? They heard I was having a hard time. I let them in. And the first thing they said is, do you have food and water? Would you like a drink of water? How's your dog doing? Can we walk around the block? It looks like your dog maybe could use a walk. Totally put me off guard. I was like, who are these nice people? What's going on? Right? I was like,
that's interesting. So you've actually seen the advancement.
Yes. I've seen different types of, and been a recipient of different types of interventions when in a mental health crisis, from, police with no training, no bueno. You have CIT training, you have a mental health person along with them, which is the crisis intervention team training. That was better. And sometimes it, again, still depends on the person that's coming. And then also, I've also seen when a peer has also been involved along with another mental health professional to be part of that community response. And then there are things that we can do in advance. We can have wellness recovery action plans. We can have advanced directives so that we're prepared and people know what will be helpful when we are in a situation where we need more support. And then they can start to activate that plan that you've built. So you're more likely to participate in it because you built it. So I think there are lots of things that we could do. And me personally, I don't think police have a role in responding to a mental health crisis. Do they have a role in responding to violence? Yes. Mental health crisis, I don't think so personally.
It's interesting because a lot of people, when this comes up, they're like, well, who else do we call? So it's interesting to hear you say there are all other alternatives to intervention that work. Mm-hmm. There are things that work. And because people have never seen those things work, they don't believe that they exist. So I have to say, I'm completely surprised and shocked by that. And I'm so happy to hear that there are ways that you can intervene in a mental health call that are successful and that come out well and don't end up in somebody in jail for absolutely no reason. I think that's wonderful. That's fantastic. It's about time for us to wrap up. So I'm going to ask each of you to just kind of collectively give us a wrap up on how we should deal with our mental health from day to day, whether it's something that we've had to function with as a functioning depressant or mental health patient, or whether it's something that we're just figuring out, oh Lord, we've got these issues now and don't know how to handle or control them. Yvette, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Tammy. And so the first thing I would want to say is to just understand mental health is just part of the health continuum. There's physical health, there's mental health. We're one body, that we have emotional health and we have physical health. And to not allow the thought about, oh, something's going on with me with my emotional health to frighten us. Because if I had a, pain in my side, I'd say, oh, I got a pain in my side. I need to go and get some help for that. Yeah. So similarly, when we find that, wait a minute, I'm having some different thoughts. I'm having some different emotions that I didn't have before. Or, I've dealt with anxiety throughout my life, but it's a little different now. It's a little more intense. To just understand that I'm responding to something. When we experience these things, it's a sign that something is happening in our environment that we're responding to. And then how do I then get support and help for that? Do I start, Dr. Bonds talked about being able to recognize, is my functioning significantly impacted? I no longer want to leave the house when I have essential business to do as I keep myself safe during the COVID-19 times. Or is it that I'm able to go out, but I just recognize I have a little bit more anxiety? Who do I connect with? A dear friend, a loved one, my community supports, church community, wherever. Who do I connect with so I can just share these things and get support and feedback? And then if I recognize it's a little bit more intense, as Dr. Bonds kind of described so wonderfully, then who do I reach out to? We've shared with you our helpline that people can always call to facilitate access to care. We've talked about access to care today, and DMH is present and available to be able to provide emotional support through our DMH helpline. And so that is something that our community, our LA County residents can reach out and call us. And we have folks available to speak with them, to provide support. And if additional support is needed past what we can provide, we will connect them and link them to needed supports. So to not back up from it, recognize that it's just part of being a human, is that I have my mental health being and I have my physical health being. It's just part of being a human being. And just to recognize that if something is rising up on one side, that is just an example that I'm responding to something, and then where do I go and get support, get connected into helping people.
Yes, Dr. Bond, wrap it up for us.
Well, I would start it out by saying you should just dance until you work up a good sweat and don't look back and nobody's watching. If you want to videotape it and send it out to people, you can, but probably something that's more helpful that I've adapted is meditation. And I say that because although I'm a person of faith, I know that having time out for your brain to kind of shut down and quiet down is really important. And right now, every resident in LA County has access to an application called Headspace. It's headspace.com/LA County. We, as a Department of Mental Health, saw a need because of the pandemic and all the other things that are happening to make this available as a resource. It has all kinds of exercises within it, soothing music, there's guided meditations, but through the December of this year, through the end of the year, it's actually free to county residents as a part of our initiative for prevention and early intervention. So I would say that that's one thing. And then I would echo everything that Yvette said. It's about keeping yourself surrounded by people who care and staying in touch with them and just really taking good care of yourself, doing whatever you can to use those coping strategies that have helped keep you healthy up until this point and to not back away from them.
Karis.
Sorry, I had to take myself off mute. So I think of, when I think of my mental health, especially as a person of color, I'm both Black and Indigenous, is that I always think of the MLK speech around creative maladjustment. And that, that's about not being adjusted to social injustice. That we should be angry, we should have those feels. So how do we feel those feels? How do I feel those feels? But then also stay mentally healthy, especially as somebody with a mental health condition, is I do all of the things everybody else has already said, well, except maybe the dancing until I sweat and sending it out to people, I don't do that. But I do try to find those things that are just incredibly fun for me, sometimes different for me. And I've tried a couple of different things during this pandemic period, but also connecting to other people. I think our peer supporters in LA County are so helpful because you realize you're not alone. The experience you are experiencing is not this weird thing. It is really something that people can get better and work through, especially with the support of others. So, reaching out through our helpline, asking to get connected to supports and asking those supports, do you understand what it is for me to be a Black person in America today and how that can affect my mental health? And can you help me through that so that I can live with creative maladjustment, but in a healthy way?
All right, Latina, take us all home, girl.
So I think I would echo all the things that my colleagues said. The thing that I would really emphasize the most is to be honest. To be honest about how you're feeling and where you are. There's so much stigma associated with mental illness and what that means, particularly in the Black community. Raises red flags immediately when somebody talks about the fact that they're depressed or they have a mental illness. And nobody can help if you're not honest about where you are. Whether that's you're experiencing trauma related to, the civil unrest that we're in right now and all the incidents that have unfolded, or you're feeling lonely and depressed because we're all locked up and cooped up and not in connection with one another. But you have to be honest about where you are, whether you're talking to your therapist or your mother or your preacher, you have to be honest in order for people to help and reach out and use those numbers, use the meditation app, use those resources, but be honest about where you are so somebody can help.
Just so everyone will know, the Department of Mental Health helpline is 1-800-854-7771. And we've put it along this virtual session for you so that you can have access to it at any time if you should need help. It's the Department of Mental Health helpline, and it's 800-854-7771. And I'm gonna be honest with you, Latina. I'm gonna be real honest with you right now. I think my way of coping with my own mental health is dancing with a mud mask while watching Golden Girls, eating key lime pie naked. And Karis, don't knock it till you've tried it.
I'd like to see that on TikTok.
Thank you so much, Karis, Dr. Bonds, Yvette, and Latina. And thank you for watching the KJLH Virtual Women's Health Expo Mental Health Panel and Breakout Session. I'm Tammy Mack. Peace,
The
y'all.
KJLH 20th Annual Women's Health Expo at KJLHradio.com. Presented virtually by RastAfri and Radio Free KJLH.